Hello and welcome back to Easy as IEP. This is section 6. We'll be talking about short-term objectives. My name is Catalina Uribe and I'm a clinical support administrator at the UM-NSU Center for Autism. So in the law, while it's not a requirement, objectives may be written into the IEP along with the annual goals. Objectives are short-term benchmarks or milestones that can be used to measure a child's progress toward the bigger target, which is that big annual goal. The parents may request that short-term objectives be included, if they're not already, in order to track how a child is progressing towards his or her annual goals. So, types of objectives. This is really my personal view on them. The benchmarks is not a formal name for this, but I have not found a formal name for it. A lot of people refer to the objectives any which way as benchmarks themselves. So this is the way that I'm trying to differentiate them. So most often I'll see 4 objectives written into the IEP, and that makes sense because there are 4 quarters in a year. So ideally, a child will master 1 objective per quarter, or 1 quarter of the goal every progress report. However, I've also seen goals that have 2 or 3 objectives, and I've seen goals that have 7 objectives. So it really depends on where the child is currently and where they are expected to go and how many stepping stones they'll need along the way in order to master that goal. So the first type of objective that I see, and this is the most common one, it's a prompt hierarchy. So for example, by May 2021, given an adapted writing utensil, for example, a shortened crayon, Carlos will write his name independently in 4 out of 5 opportunities. The way that we see a prompt hierarchy set up is you start with the most amount of prompting and move towards the least. So in the annual goal, the last objective should always match up to the final goal. In this case, it says that Carlos will write his name independently. So we see that the last objective ends with him writing his name independently. Along the way, you decide what prompts are necessary. So first here, we started with verbal, gestural, and visual prompts. And then we start removing the most intrusive, which would be the verbal. So we leave gestural and visual. The next intrusive one is gestural because it still requires a second person in order to provide that prompt, which leaves us with visual. And finally, visual prompt, however common, is still a prompt. So when we remove it, it leaves independence. A benchmark, however, is a little bit different because it works on, the way I describe it is it works on different skills that build upon each other to meet that goal. So when we have the same goal of May 2021, Carlos will write his name independently, we see that the first objective here is Carlos will imitate writing his name, which means like a teacher model. So it's still prompted. Then we see Carlos will trace his name. This would be considered a visual prompt because he sees his name and then he's writing right over it. The third objective here is Carlos will copy his name from a model, still a visual prompt. But again, you're building on these skills. So first he was following an adult who's probably providing not only that visual feedback, but verbal feedback. Okay, we start at the top, curve to make the C, jump to the next letter. The second one where he's tracing, he might be getting that verbal feedback still by a teacher, or he might just be relying on the visual. By the time he's copying, however, he doesn't have the lines to trace over, so it's a higher level skill. And then finally, we say that Carlos will write his name independently. So not only is he not receiving prompting from an adult, but he's writing it completely without a model either. When you Google prompt hierarchy, you'll get tens, if not hundreds of different options. Of course, different visuals work for different people, and you, as a parent, if you're wanting to print this out in order to learn and in order to monitor yourself when you're working with your child, You should look at whichever visual will help you best understand. However, there is one point that I do want to make. These are two of the basic models you'll find. That you have like the long, tower, and then you have more of a triangle version. Technically, there are other prompts that are possible, but these are the general categories, and really all you need to know for basic understanding of prompting. So looking at these two, you can see that aside from the shape, the difference between these two visuals is the placement of their visual prompt. So here in the tower, we see that visual is at the very top, which is most prompting to least prompting. And then in the triangle, when we follow that most to least still, we see visual below gestural and verbal. So which one do you think is the correct order? The correct version is the one on the left, the tower. We all use visuals day in and day out. Visuals are a natural part of our environment. We see them as traffic signs and signals on our phones, like the notification bubbles when we have a message. Our calendars and our agendas are visuals, and maybe even those sticky notes everywhere on your desk, if you're anything like me, are visuals. So a visual is much, much less intrusive and therefore more independent than a verbal or gestural prompt. The simplest way to picture this is that a verbal and gestural prompt both involve another person doing the prompting, whereas a visual, when used simply as a visual, it requires the individual to prompt themselves, essentially. So if you have to rely on someone else in order to know what to do, wouldn't you agree that that's much less independent? So here we see broken down in the example of Carlos writing his name, a prompt hierarchy of what these prompts will look like. The most help would be hand over hand, the teacher grabbing Carlos's hand and writing his name. The next one is a partial physical, which is maybe physical prompting on part of the name or maybe just a letter, right? So maybe the teacher starts hand over hand and then kind of finishes off independently, or maybe the child is forgetting how to come back up on an R, so the teacher will push the hand to finish that R only. Modeling is when an adult shows how to write a name or a letter, or even just part of a letter. Gestural, so this can be either finger spelling or pointing, if there's a visual in place, pointing to that visual, so pointing either to the next letter or pointing to the shape that the letter takes. A verbal prompt would be the adult saying, for example, what letter comes next, or strokes. So when he's writing an A, you say, you go around, come up, and straight line down. And then a visual is just the visual itself. It's important to note that sometimes prompts are used in conjunction with each other. So I can always say, point to your nose. And if I'm saying this, that's just a gestural. But if I'm saying, point to your nose, that's a verbal and a gestural. So when you have a visual, in and of itself, that is a visual cue. When you add something else to it, for example, pointing to the visual, it's no longer a visual cue and it becomes a gestural cue. So that's also important to know when you're taking data. But why is the prompt hierarchy important? Well, I think you'll agree that, whenever possible, the goal of learning any skill is to learn it to independence. That's the ultimate goal that we hope for our children, our students, and anybody that we are teaching. So ideally, you'll want to take a look at your child's goals and decide whether you'd like to ask for the goals to be written differently. Then spark a conversation with the teacher and other members of the IEP team. So for example, instead of having the annual say, Carlos will write his name given gestural and visual prompts, maybe the goal can be, Carlos will write his name with 2 or less mistakes independently. While the end result is less ideal because he's making two since he is working towards independence, the teachers will be working actively on giving him less and less prompting in order to master that independence. The reason I recommend this is because we often see kids become what we call prompt dependent, meaning they depend on an adult prompt to initiate, continue, or complete a task. I commonly saw this in the preschool setting when we're trying to teach sentence starters such as I want. There are two main problems that can happen. One, they will only use I want and won't generalize to other carrier phrases that might sound more natural. And two, this is the big one, once the adult starts to fade the prompting, the child begins to prompt the teacher to prompt him. So when we start out, and maybe you're familiar with a sentence starter strip, it's 3 visuals, usually, board maker visuals. The first one says I want or I want, 2 pictures, and then the third one will be, let's say, cookies. So when I'm teaching a child to expand his repertoire of verbal language by including that I want sentence starter, I'll say I want cookies. I'll model it for him a few times, him or her. And then let's say he's got it. The child knows that when we get to the end of the sentence, he gets cookies. But he also knows that I normally prompt him. So when I try to hold back on that prompt, what we see is the child saying, I want, I want, I want, I want, while looking at you because they want you to say it. They don't understand that them saying it is enough. So we get kind of stuck in that never-ending loop. Whereas if Carlos, in our example, was learning to write his name independently from the beginning, even though he's making 2 mistakes, let's say, he's still being more independent than if he wrote his name with gestural and visual prompts along the way. So when we break down large goals into smaller steps that are independent in the benchmark example, then the child is likely to have better outcomes overall. And you don't want to forget to ensure the accuracy of the objectives. Remember that last objective should typically match the goal exactly. You should watch for repeated objectives. Sometimes teachers, as I did, work out of templates and we copy and paste incorrectly. So make sure that you take your draft IEP and you really look at if there are differences and if those differences make sense. And then confirm that each objective is different in itself as well. Again, I'd like to point you to our Padlet where I post all of the PDFs for each presentation. I also post a lot of resources that I find along the way that might help you in your IEP journey. And with that, I hope you learned a lot today, and I hope to see you for session number 7.